Good day to you. My name is Tony Ballinger, and this is the Fighting Men of Rhodesia series. My guest today is Alan Balson, and I got hold of Alan through a good friend of mine, Lorna Kelly, who does portraits of Rhodesian soldiers, both male and female. And she did a drawing off the internet of Alan and sent it to me asking who he was. And I said I had no idea. So I put his portrait on the RLI page on Facebook. And many men came forward very quickly to say, that's Alan Balson. So I thought, well, while I've got him on Facebook, it'll be a good opportunity to invite him on board. And so maybe John can say I'll get insert that picture of Alan. And just a little advertising plug for Lorna Kelly. She's done many portraits of Rhodesian soldiers, both male and female. And if you would like your portrait done off a very good photograph, one of reasonable clarity, she'd be only too willing to do that. And you can contact her through me in the notes at the bottom of this video. So there's a couple of examples I can show you of her work. The first one is Alan Franklin. I think he was a well-known SAS guy, or should I say, Salute Scouts. And then there's Dan Brunt, cheeky-looking face he's got. And lastly, Clive Midlane from Grey Scouts. We've had Clive on here before, and his talk was really worth listening to. So I'd like to welcome you on board, Alan. It's lovely to see you here. And maybe we can start off for the next few minutes with you explaining who you are, where you came from, and how you ended up in the Rhodesian Army.
Hi, Tony. My name, of course, is Alan Balson, and I was a white African, but from East Africa. I was born there, as were my parents. And when I was at school in the UK, I wanted to do agriculture, and the best agricultural college in Africa was in Rhodesia, and it was called Gwebi College. So I applied at Gwebi College and did my first year practical in Zambia, and then came down to Gwebi. I was there for 2 years. And in that time, quite a lot of my friends who I knew at Gwebi, especially just after we left, got killed by terrorists on their farms. And a lot of the farmers were getting attacked all the time. So then I decided to join the army. And in December 1977, I happened to receive my call up, and I went to Llewellyn and then to School of Infantry, where I passed out actually with the Commandant's Award, top of my class. And I was posted to 1 Indep company, RAR. My course officer was a fellow called Mark Adams. He was Lieutenant Mark Adams from the RLI. And Henny Van Vuren, color sergeant, was the course chase around man. He used to have us running up and down mountains and things. But it was excellent. And then from there, I arrived at 1 Indep at that time in Victoria Falls. And the story goes from there.
Yeah, I remember, I think that was Don Price, of course, wasn't it?
Yes.
I joined Don while still at 4 Indep just a few months before you joined him. But I was only with him for 2 days, and then I got blown up in a landmine on my R&R. So I didn't get to serve with Don, unfortunately, but I think 4 Indep then went somewhere else, if I'm not mistaken, and 1 Indep moved to Vic Falls. So that's where you were with Don. And tell us a bit about what happened there under 1 Indep with Don.
Okay, so our 2IC was a guy called Lieutenant Neil Jackson. He was from support commander in RLI originally. And when we arrived, there was a lot of traffic crossing the Zambezi River, with the terrorists coming in, crossing the river and going to Botswana, and then infiltrating further down. So my first deployment was to go into the valley, but just to back up a little bit. When I arrived, I was put in charge of 3 platoon. 3 platoon had a very unfortunate incident in Essex Vale. And it happened in April of 78. So when I had finished my training and got sent to one Indep, I arrived in one Indep possibly around the end of July. Now, 3 platoon was broken up and divided amongst the other platoons because it was a horrific incident. I'll just talk a little bit about it just to make everyone understand what went on there.
Yeah.
There were 4 people killed and 4 wounded. So upon returning from R&R on that Monday, 20 members of our one Indep company, RAR, had drawn rifles and live ammunition for retraining purposes. They assembled at the end of a football field where they stripped their weapons for cleaning prior to moving to the rifle range for firing practice. Once the group had stripped their FNs, a private Robert Nyamini Mapfumo suddenly cocked his rifle and opened fire on automatic at his fellow soldiers. As Mafumo's 20-round magazine emptied and before he could replace it with fully charged one, Private Mazonda and Zebe overpowered and disarmed Mapfumo. Tragically, though, 4 lay dead and 4 were seriously wounded. Corporal Stephen Randall of Bulawayo, Lance Corporal Michael Wall of Kwekwe, Sergeant Kevin Bicknell of Hartley, and Private John Schumer of Bembezi had lost their lives. Sergeant Vic Anderson, Corporal Malcolm Partridge, Lance Corporal Rob Garizito, and Private David Chiremba had been wounded. In spite of claiming insanity, Mapfumo was found guilty of murder in the High Court of Bulawayo, and he was sentenced to death and hung. So one thing he did say, just as he was caught by Zebe, he said, "I've got mine." So that was a horrific incident.
Judging by the number of white guys that were killed, do you think that was racially motivated at all?
It more than likely was, and that incident actually changed how 3 platoon operated for the rest of the time. We only ever mixed up. We never sat all whites or all blacks. We completely integrated our group and became actually a very cohesive platoon because of that. But so when I arrived, there was absolute horrific memories of this, and we had to try and rebuild our platoon with new people. And I remember the very first time that we got deployed into the Zambezi, we walked in and I sat all my guys around and I gave them sort of a chivvy up talk, of what we were doing and why we were doing it. And we then went on into the Zambezi and had a very large presence, so much so that when we came out after our first trip, the Rhodesians had intercepted talk from the Zambians that we were setting up a base camp in the valley. So there was no sneaking around. We were very overt.
And what was the mixture of white to black? Because when I left for Indep and joined one Indep, it was still Rhodesia Regiment, and then it was rebadged as RAR in early 1978. And I found thereafter that there was a much smaller percentage of white fellows. Did you have that same sort of ratio in your platoon?
Yeah, we had about 6 whites and the rest, I think, 22 or 23 AS in our troop or our platoon. And a lot of the ES were junior NCOs. We did have a sergeant. My sergeant at the time was Kevin Lothian, and he went back to School of Infantry and became an officer later on in another time. But no, it was very good. I operated with a white corporal and 2 AS in my stick, the white corporal Del Pino. He was just getting me acquainted with everything because I was still brand new at this running around the bushes business.
You mentioned these groups of Zipper coming across the river and then dog-legging it south of Kazungula into Botswana, where they would then go down the border and re-enter somewhere around Plumtree or somewhere around that area.
Yes.
A very good example of this type of event taking place. There's Clive Midlane's talk, if anybody wants to look up that. I don't have the talk number. But he indicated that they were bumping into very large groups. They were very sophisticated. They had radio contact between themselves, and they actually fought in proper skirmishing fashion rather than running with their weapon over their shoulder. Did you encounter anything like that while you were up there?
I didn't personally, though we did track a very large group that left a swath through the bush, and they had stopped at a place called San Simba Springs, which was on the escarpment. And while we were on the escarpment looking around, we found a bayonet and a lot of garbage that they had dropped around. And they then went into Botswana. But Don Price himself had a lot of very, very interesting recce's into Botswana. And I'm sure he's probably spoken about them with you, with one Indep on this. And it was just huge.
Indeed, he did. I can't remember. I think it was his third talk, possibly even fourth talk. He mentioned going in with a few guys, Theo and Al and a couple of others, into Botswana, and they found a camp there of over 500. But for one reason or another, it was never attacked. Commonwealth didn't do anything about it. But yes, he said there was substantial numbers over there. And then, is there anything else that happened while you were with Don up at Vic Falls?
Yes, I have a very interesting story. Just 1 second. It was of a lion attack that happened to my troop one evening. We were walking, cross-graining, and then we would always set up an ambush at night. And there were 4 of us. And we settled down and we put the machine gun facing one way. I was in the middle. Zeve, the same guy who stopped the shooting at Essexvale, was with me. And he had actually also been wounded in a previous incident, and he had a scar on his arm. He used to always face backwards. And then I had the AS, Delpino, next to me. So we settled down for the night and we were taking turns doing guard. And about just after dusk, the bush above our head, we were sort of half under a bush watching a path, started to shake violently. And it was elephants, and they were literally about 6 yards from us. So I threw a yellow smoke grenade, and it went off with quite a bang. I didn't even know these things made such a loud noise when they went off. But the elephants all took off. And then we laughed a bit because it was actually quite unnerving, because it was a little herd, probably about 10, but they were very close. And then we settled down for the night. And while I was sleeping, Zeve was on guard. And he came to me and said, "Sir, 3 times lion." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Lion, 3 times." So what he meant was a lion had come up and sniffed him 3 times. And so I said, "Where is it?" And he said, "Right there." And I was looking off into the distance, and it was dark. But then my eyes dropped, and right in front of us was a lion, probably about 6 or 7 yards away. And then it came at us, straight charge, full on. Zeve leapt out of his sleeping bag and landed on my chest. The lion grabbed hold of his sleeping bag and ran off to the right, knocked over Dubé's machine gun, and then dropped the sleeping bag at the same time. He swatted the sleeping bag a couple of times as he grabbed it, because it was right in front of me. I couldn't do anything with this guy jumping up and down on my chest. Delpino threw a instant light grenade, and you could see the lion just walking away, not even running that fast, looking back at us through the bush. And Dubé picked up Zeve's sleeping bag and gave it back to him, but Zeve didn't want anything to do with it. He righted his machine gun, and then we started laughing. And we laughed a long time. And one of the reasons why we were laughing was we had been up for resupply the week before, and our medic, who was a guy at the time called Chris Nkubi, had, he wasn't well, I can't remember what the story was, but he left. but he took the medic pack with him. So here we were marching around the Zambezi Valley, 4 of us, without any form of medic at all, except for our first field dressing in our pockets. So that would have been quite a thing if the lion had got a hold of us.
Yeah, definitely.
That was actually quite a funny incident, but it could have been more serious than what it was. Well, because it was all really close. This lion was at my feet.
Yeah.
Playing around with his sleeping bag.
The lion was probably didn't have fear of man because it was a national park, and they weren't hunted to a large extent until after the war. They were really hammered. But yeah, so the lion had the familiarity with human beings. And one of our ambushes also before Indep had a lion charge it. Fortunately, the guy who was awake plugged it right between the chest, but between the front legs. But national parks wanted to prosecute him. He really had to prove they actually came out to the ambush position and took measurements of the paw marks, and it was close to the guy being arrested. They were very serious about it.
Yeah, and that was about the only real thing that happened while I was at Vic Falls, because very soon after that, in August or July, we went down to Bite Bridge from there. And Bite Bridge was infested with terrorists. And it had a unique situation. There was both Zanla and Zipra there. So we were fighting both, and they were fighting each other, which was, really amazing. And I would just like to mention here about a fellow soldier, Graham Watson Smith. Early on in our deployment down into Bite Bridge, and this brings up the factor that Zanla and Zipra were fighting against each other. So Graham Watson Smith actually came down to Bite Bridge. It was about 6 months after we were there in 79. And he had finished a course at the School of Infantry. And we were extremely busy with terrorists running around the bushes there. So in May 79, Lieutenant Watson Smith was on a routine patrol in Sioka, northwest of Bite Bridge, in an area where several skirmishes had recently taken place between Zanla and Zipra groups, battling for control of the frontline territory. The 4-man call sign was sweeping along a dry riverbed close to the boundary with the European farming area when they came to face with a group of 9 Turs, also moving along the same riverine valley towards them. A fierce simultaneous exchange of fire took place, during which 2 of Watson Smith's inexperienced African soldiers absconded, running back down the river valley away from the intense fire. The young officer and his MAG gunner, Privates Percy Chinyanyiki, bravely stood their ground and took cover behind some scattered boulders lying on the riverbed. They returned the Zipra fire with a vengeance. Unbeknown to the inexperienced officer, they had run into a command group of 9 high-ranking Zipra fighters who were on an aggressive reconnaissance patrol looking to push further south into Zanla operational area. Realizing they had superiority of numbers and mistakenly believing that they had contacted a small group of Zanla cadres, the Zipra men pressed forward with their attack using fire movement tactics to aggressively advance on the 2 remaining soldiers crouching behind the boulders. Second Lieutenant Watson Smith, having been on the right flank of the sweep when the contact had initiated, was able to crawl unseen and up onto a bank. And when he ran along the riverline ridge, he looked down and saw all the Zipra fighters lying there, firing at the MAG gunner, and he literally, with very accurate shooting, killed 7 of them, and the other 2 ran away. One of them dropped his PPSH as he took off. So he killed 7 high-ranking soldiers from Zipra, and between the 2 of them, Second Lieutenant Watson Smith and Private Percy accounted for 7 out of the group of 9 terrorists that day and recovered 3 brand new Bakelite AKMs, 2 standard AKMs, 2 AKSs, and an SK and a PPSH, along with everything else, a medic pack, and an incredible amount of documents. So this was an incredible feat done by 2 people without air support. And Graham Watson Smith was posted to 1 RAR shortly after that incident. And he fought in the Battle of
in Tumbani,
I think it was called.
In Tumbani, yeah.
Yes. And then after all the hostilities and the forces were integrated, he went to fight with the Sultan of Oman in Oman. And he was actually killed in a motorbike accident after only a couple of years in 1982. So that was very sad, but a very, very brave young man.
Very brave. And the action that you described is reminiscent of Theo Nell, who did a flanking attack on some Zipra guys and stole their RPG-7 and sorted them out with it. And he got a Bronze Cross for that. And I really feel that this young man should have got some type of award for that. A very brave thing to do. And maybe John Kinsale can insert the photograph of all the weapons that were captured in that contact with them put up against a wall.
I sent the picture to you.
Yeah. So John will be doing that. Yeah, very brave indeed. And before we go on, Alan, that whole area that we're referring to at Bright Bridge, it wasn't east of Bright Bridge. It was between the Bulawayo and the Salisbury roads, if I'm not mistaken. Is what they call the V area or the V territory or whatever.
That was Mtatengwe TTL was between the two roads, and we deployed in there, and also Masera TTL and Sioka, which was on the west side of Bright Bridge, and then we went to the east side towards the Booby River as well. We basically covered that whole area. It was pretty, and where this fight took place was in Sioka TTL.
And in hindsight, do you think it was a blunder on our side not to let Zipra and Zandler beat the hell out of each other there and then go in and try and establish superiority later? Or was that not a good tactical decision?
I don't know about what was what. I do know that Zipra were far better than Zandler with what they did.
Oh, absolutely.
I had a small run-in with them one time, and it gave me a fright. And later on, mainly I worked in between the two in Mtatengwe, and that's where I had a lot of contacts with Zandler, mainly Zandler. And I learned one thing, and I had mentioned this prior, is that you have no time in a contact, 0 time. If you see somebody, don't try to do anything fancy with your troop, just kill them. And you might only get one, but at least you'll get someone, because the terrorists had an amazing system of gapping. And within 3 seconds, there was no one around. They were all disappeared. And there were very few times when they stayed and fought, unless they had real superior numbers.
Yeah, especially amongst Zandler. Zipper were very stubborn, in fact. Can you give us an example of one or two of those contacts in that area, Alan?
Yep, I can. There was one contact that happened in Mtatengwe that I was patrolling with 5 other soldiers, and we were cross-training, and we didn't have fire force, but we did have PRAW aircraft, Police Reserve Air Wing, that would fly around. And in one of these contacts, when we were walking around, we happened to stop for tea, and it was about 4:30 in the afternoon, and we had taken off our packs and put them under a bush, and we had our cookers going, and we were having tea, and we hadn't seen any terrorists. And then we heard a shot, and I was with a very, very experienced soldier, Sergeant Duncan MacArthur. He was with me, and we had him, myself, and 4 AS. So there were 6 of us. When the rifle shot went off, we quickly grabbed our gear and our webbing, which we had. Basically, we had our webbing on our rifles. We got up, turned off our fires, turned off our burners, and we headed off in the direction where this shot had gone. As we were walking, we saw a group of African women, AMAs, African males and African females coming towards us, and the females had food on their heads. So there was an African male in the front. We said stop, and they immediately ran like hell. And we shot the one man who had a bag hanging over his shoulder, and he fell down, and the rest all disappeared. Then we went up to him, and he was wounded quite badly, but we patched him up and even put him on a drip, and it was the first time that I'd actually really been in contact with a situation like that. And he was a bag carrier, and he had a tremendous amount of information and also quite a lot of money. So we grabbed the bag, left him where he was, and we carried on walking. And we came into a huge camp. It must have been about 100 meters wide and 200 meters long. And it was just full of sleeping places, and they had a lot of plastic bags and stuff stuffed into the ground. They had drums of millet there, and RPG boosters that they screw into those rockets.
Yeah.
So as we were walking through the camp, we were sweeping in extended line. We got fired upon with, it was quite harsh, but it was all very high. And I don't know what got into us, but Duncan and myself shouted, "Charge!" And we charged at this group of terrorists that were about 30 at that time, and probably more. Some people say there were 60 there, but I don't know. We charged right at them, firing away, and my machine gunner was on my left, and he was firing short, sharp bursts.
Oh.
And when we charged, we arrived to where they were, and they had run, but there were a lot of doppies on the ground. So then we did a quick sweep, and I made sure the machine gunner carried on firing to chase them away, or, try and hit more. There was one blood spore there, and we followed it a little ways. But now, remember I said it was almost in the evening? It was getting dark. And I said, oh my God, we better go back and find our packs. Now, we must have walked about 400 yards from where our packs were. It was getting dark. And we honestly believed we would never find them again. And then we were sweeping through the bush to where we thought we were. There was no GPS in those days, of course. And then we came across our packs, amazingly, and put them on, went straight back to that camp and set up an ambush in the camp that night. There were also, and I didn't actually know this before, but it had quite a lot of povo in the camp. That was like the locals supporting the terrorists. And they had dogs. And I think they used to use them as a warning system if someone was coming. But there was a lot of dogs barking all night, and we could hear movement, and nothing happened in the night. Then the next day, as we packed up, we got up really early and started to move to the road. One of my soldiers, I can't remember who, had something wrong with his eyes. So we started to go, and as we were going, we went past this fellow that we had put the drip in, and he had passed away. So we carried on to the road, and as we were walking, there was a hell of a contact going on right next to us, probably within a kilometer. And it was about, they say, about 60 terrorists as well there. And Don Price came with a helicopter that came from South Africa and flew in. The helicopter came after Don Price. Don Price and Neil Jackson were in a Cessna, and Neil Jackson was shooting a machine gun, an MAG, out the back door of a Cessna. This sounds ridiculous, but it's actually what we did. And he was sitting on a metal plate, and the Cessna got shot There were a number of bullet holes in it, but one of them hit the metal plate under Jackson, and he thought he was going to die because he thought he was bleeding. And then a guy called Ola Grinnaka, he was a South African pilot, came in his Alouette, and the Barros was a soldier who had actually been wounded. And I believe he had picked up the Barros, put him in the chopper, and as he was flying from where he had picked him up, he received a horrendous amount of flak from the ground that severed his hydraulic lines. But somehow he managed to get it back to Bite Bridge. So this was within about 5 kilometers of Bite Bridge. This is how close the terrorists were at that time. And he crashed his helicopter in Bite Bridge on the runway, and the plane that Don was in landed with a lot of bullet holes in it as well. So I think they counted the amount of bullet holes, but I think Don mentioned this in a previous story, but it was absolutely ridiculous.
In fact, the chopper tech of that very helicopter has just done a talk about half a dozen ago. Grinnaka's chopper tech, a very enlightening story, and it coincides with what you're saying. Unbelievable that they survived that, actually.
It is, and it just shows you how brazen they were. There was another contact there as well, where we had killed a couple of Zanla, and I was with a guy called Keith Alford. He was a lieutenant, and we had 3 sticks, and we went and we set up an ambush inside their base camp. And while we were sitting there, we heard a landmine go off that actually blew a tire and wrecked a RL. And that night, the terrorists came back in 3 times, and 3 times they attacked us, and 3 times we fought them off. And it was, those early days in Bright Bridge were pretty crazy.
And they were the zipper side of the lot, were they not the Zanla?
These ones, I'm sure they were Zanla. But they had large numbers. They used to run around in groups of 60, which is absolutely almost impossible to believe.
Yeah, they did. I mean, as far inland as towards the Russian front, Matidi Tribal Trust Land, where I operated, they were in gangs of 60 to 100. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was good. Then I have a bit of a funny story for you. It's about my battle with a tapeworm. This story is actually not for the faint of heart, because until you've had a tapeworm, you don't really know how that whole thing works. But anyway, when I was at School of Infantry, there used to be an absolute horrible feeling as I could feel this worm wriggle its way out of my butt. And so I would grab it. And one day I grabbed one and stuck it in a bottle of water and took it to the doctor and said, "What the hell is this thing? I get these all the time." And he looked at it, and it actually was a mature segment of a tapeworm, but a mature segment of a tapeworm actually looks like a roundworm. It's just fat and it wriggles around. It's a female and it's full of eggs, but I never knew. So I was probably reinfecting myself all the time. But anyway, I went on roundworm pills and nothing happened. So I just lived with this bloody thing that was absolutely insane. Anyway, fast forward 6 months later, we're in Imtatengwe, and I have my whole platoon is out in the bush, and we're having contacts, and we had a contact where there were 2 terrorists killed, and I had with me a radio operator on a TR-48. We used to call him Sparky. And I actually suddenly needed to take a dump really badly in the middle of this contact, but I was on the hill sort of controlling what was going on. So I ran off, found a boulder, squatted, and took a dump. And there in the dump, good Lord, was a segment of tapeworm, about 8 bits all joined together. So I knew what my worm was. I was really excited. Ran back to Sparky. Now, this was in the middle of a contact, mind you. And I said, hey, tell Bite Bridge, my worm is a tapeworm. And get the medic, the doctor. We actually had a MSU unit there. And with a doctor, because we saw a tremendous amount of action. And he was also patching up civilians a lot of the time as well, African civilians. So anyway, this is probably the first in the history of warfare where instead of sending lock stats and whatever else Sparky was supposed to be doing, he was relaying to the head office that Balson had a tapeworm. So the doctor went to Messina and he got the correct medicine. And when I came out of the bush about 3 days later and went to the officers' mess, which at Bite Bridge was pretty standard bush mess, he had the tablet on the bar and a glass of warm water sitting with it. 2 glasses of warm water with salt in it. And he said, here, chew up this tablet and then drink these 2 glasses of salt water.
Oh, no.
So I did that. And there was probably about 15 officers and sergeants and other people all crowded around to see what was going on. And after about half an hour, I had an immense urge to take a dump. And so I charged off for the shitter. And someone yelled, don't use the long drop. So I skidded to a halt, took a dump. And you won't believe this. There were about 8 guys around me watching what the hell was going on here. And out came this beast from hell. And a fellow called, he was a lieutenant with artillery, Neville Vickery, had grabbed 2 sticks and picked up this deceased tapeworm.
Good.
And it went up from the ground over a stick that was held up over his head, down to the ground again, up over the stick and down to the ground again. It was a veritable monster. It was probably about 18 feet long.
Good Lord, Alan. Good Lord. How?
So anyway, and you know what? I have a lot of witnesses to this bloody great thing.
God.
But it was something that plagued me all the way from School of Infantry for 2 years.
Well,
I never ever knew it was a tapeworm.
How do you think you caught it? Have any idea?
Probably eating pork that wasn't cooked properly, because that's where it normally comes from.
And
so anyway, I survived the war. The craziest thing was, whenever I took a dump in the bush, I was reinfecting all the blacks in the area, or all the local population, because I would look in my crap and there were all these white things wiggling around in it. And I said, that's just the roundworm. But they were all female tapeworm full of eggs.
Yeah. And then a pig would come and eat it. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a story you want on here. Anyhow, fighting Men of Rhodesia, the things we used to fight with.
We can retitle it to the crapping Men of Rhodesia.
Yes.
So did that affect your weight and your energy levels?
It everybody was always amazed at how much I used to eat and the fact that I was always so skinny. So that solved that problem.
The proof is in the womb.
Yes.
Good Lord.
Oh, well, anyway, we'll move on from there. I have a story, and I never actually knew this story was written until the book Masoja came out. And somebody contacted me and said, Alan, do you know that you're written up in the RAR regimental history? And I said, no, I didn't know that. And it was put in there by, I think it was Brigadier Heppenstall, who wrote the book along with Alex Bindra. And it was from my contact report that they had in there, complete with the drawing that I did do at the time. And it's actually quite interesting. And I'll read it to you. 3 days before Christmas, Second Lieutenant Balson of 1 Indep Company RAR and 2 other call signs were guided to an enemy base camp in the Sioka Tribal Trust Land. This was in response to an intelligence report to which Fire Force Delta, which had been allocated to support SLU scouts in the Gwanda area, and unable to react. The unavailability of a Fire Force reaction at this juncture should give the non-Rhodesian readers some idea of the paucity of helicopter resources prevailing at the height of the war. On nearing the base camp at first light, and we had set off at 2 a.m. that morning, on nearing the base at first light, one of Balson's 12 men, Private R. Nkubi, saw an insurgent and gave his patrol commander the agreed silent signal. All troops immediately went to ground, and Balson with his MAG gunner moved forward to an anthill. Here, the vegetation was very dense, making visibility difficult. However, after a few moments, he was able to detect movement near a large tree 75 meters to his left. He also heard voices. He signaled to all his troops to line up with him. After watching the base camp for a further 2 minutes, he decided it was time for action. Using the anthill as a makeshift tripod for the MAG, he indicated to his men that he was going to fire. As soon as the insurgent became visible, Balson opened fire with his FN and killed him. All 3 call signs put down intense fire into the area of the camp, killing in the process the other 2 occupants. After about 45 seconds, Balson ordered a charge, and the troops ran forward in an extended line, firing into all likely cover. As they overran the camp, they came across the corpses of the insurgents, spaced over 30 meters. They went on for another 400 meters, then turned back. While recovering the dead man's weapons, Balson ordered the call sign 13 Alpha to do a 360-degree, and that was Grant Footer, to search the area. They returned shortly to report 2 more camps, each for 3 men, about 50 meters apart to the west. This meant that, of course, 6 insurgents had escaped. Food was found in one of the camps. The call signs then cleared the corrals to the northwest in the hope that some of the fugitives may have sought refuge there, but nothing was found. Spoor was lost in the tracks of cattle mingling around in the area. All the call signs had demonstrated aggression during the assault, and Price commented on Balson's good and decisive leadership. So there was just one other part to that. When we went through all the terrorists' gear, I noticed that one of the magazines had been shot with a bullet, and I emptied out the bullets and found a cartridge, which I still have to this day, with a hole right through the center of it.
Unreal. Right?
And I kept that with me for all these years.
That's a lovely souvenir.
Yes, and there were 3 terrorists killed there, and no, it was good. But that was what we faced a lot. We didn't have much air support.
Alan, tell us, how aggressive were your troops? Did they sort of flounder when you gave the command to assault a position, or was it the leaders going? Never.
The 2 times that I ordered a charge, which actually astounded people that I would order a charge in the Rhodesian Bush War, but both times shouted very vigorously. And I honestly think that that is a triggering word that kicks in. When you shout charge, you forget everything and you charge. And that's exactly what we did. And it would be a fast charge. The one thing on this incident that I noticed was not only the terrorists, but also ourselves. There were bullet marks up in the trees 15 feet into the air. And and not a few, like lots, from both sides. And I think the reasons why we were fighting in a war where we didn't have body armor, we didn't have helmets on, we had a paucity of air support and artillery. But I feel that because of the sheer incompetence of the forces that we were fighting, it's a miracle we didn't have more casualties than we did. And I just think it's because, they knew how to run and run fast. Yeah,
and shoot at birds. Yeah,
exactly.
And did you have bayonets fixed on that charge or the other one?
No, we never had bayonets fixed, actually. We were just charging. We did have a rifle grenade on the other one. And that was funny. I'd ordered one guy called Nkubi, Chris Nkubi. to put a rifle grenade on and shoot it. And it was the craziest thing that ever happened. The damn thing hit a tree and bounced down in front of us, but it didn't go off.
Probably made in China. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. It was just one of those things that was quite funny. So
and those two guys that ran away in one of your earlier contexts, did they ever redeem themselves, or were they court-martialed, or what happened to them?
I can't remember. I can't remember what happened to them. That was in Watson-Smith contact.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, we had a similar thing happen up in Victoria Falls as well, where there was someone was killed and the guy ran away, one of the AS, back to camp to tell them what had all happened.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just amazing. I do have a couple more stories here.
Yes, please.
One of them is a very interesting story. It involved a combined operation between Air Force with Canberra bombers, RLI, Support Commando, and one Indep. And I was with Theo Nell at the time.
Excellent man.
Yes, yes.
He was in my platoon. To begin with, he was a corporal, and I got made a sergeant later on. Yeah.
Yes, yes. He was a sergeant with us at one Indep, and he basically ran the recce platoon we had there, the recce troop. So this thing, it was on the Booby River, where artillery were going to attack, and the Canberra bombers were going to come in, and there was RLI support and myself with one Indep on the ground. We had about 4 stops from one Indep and RLI. So the artillery fire force with Support Commando RLI, Canberra bombers, and they were going to drop their load, and ground stops were provided by one Indep. It was going to be an early morning attack, and the artillery had to be in place as the airfield was too far away from the said target for the 25-pounders. So we mounted up and climbed into the Rodefs, pulling the cannon. Well, it wasn't too long before everything was well and truly stuck, like totally stuck. One artillery came up looking for a bar. I can't remember what for, but Sergeant Theo Nell, in a bit of humor, offered him a chocolate bar. The person being proffered the bar was not amused. So we all thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, typical Theo.
Yes. So with them all stuck and they weren't moving, we deplaned and literally skidded off into the sunset. It was pouring. We found the dry reservoir. It was on top of a hill where we were going to set off tons of light for the Canberra bombers. Theo, myself, and Mark Hellam climbed into that, and we spent the night, and it was quite dry. The bottom was dry, and it wasn't being used because it was cracked, but it was raining. At 5 a.m., we were supposed to set off the light, and we'd only got there at 2 a.m. in the morning, and we were exhausted. We woke up, and our radios were squawking about something to do with an abort of the bombers. And we thought, oh my God, we didn't set off the light. But the bombers themselves were having a communication problem, an electrical short. So they had to abort. So the attack was still on, and it was still pouring. And we were advised that artillery, due to being stuck and everything bad, they weren't going to join the party. So it was just up to the fire force. In the meantime, we climbed out of this and we went off to set up our stop group and all the other stop groups when we met our platoon again. And all the little streams that were flowing through this area had become raging torrents due to the downpour. And we were wading across these streams with water up to our chests, literally. And we ended up in a hell of a marshy, wet place. And there was no way any who was running away from the Support Commando attack would ever have been able to cross these raging torrents. Anyway, there was a massive firefight going on with Support Commando on a hill away from us and with the K cars. And it was a success. And after many hours, this whole fight was over. But one Indep was still in the swamp, waiting for these to run away, but there were no runners. And this was completely crazy. We were told by radio to walk out, and all these choppers kept flying over us and going back again. So I threw a yellow smoke indicating that I was a call sign with a broken radio. So I knew that they would come down and land, even though our radio was fine. It worked like a charm. A chopper came wheeling in and landed on a bit of high ground, and in the chopper were dead bodies. And I said to the tech to come back for the rest of us, and two of my guys climbed in and went back to the airfield. On the next round, the chopper came back, more yellow smoke was thrown, and it was the same guy with more dead bodies. So we climbed in. And this is the reason why I remember this story so vividly. The whole, I don't know anyone else who's ever said this, the whole inside of the chopper and us and the tech were all covered with the tiniest specks of blood, almost like a blanket of pepper ticks. It was amazing. There was a red claret everywhere. It makes one happy, though, that we were involved with so much bodily fluids before the arrival of AIDS, because we all breathed in this mist of blood. And you know what the creepiest thing was? The tech had blood on his teeth. That was really creepy. So,
wow, it's type of thing you read in Vietnam stories, eh? Good Lord. Wow. Alan, was that outside of the Rhodesian border? The booby, if I'm not mistaken, forms like a Y.
This was actually fairly close. I think it was Liebig's ranch.
Okay.
Or somewhere where we were set up at the time. I can't really remember. But it was, it was tributaries that all went down to the Booby River. And actually that contact was written up by Alan Binder, and he has the lockstat and everything for it in a different story.
Was that east or west or south of the Lion and Elephant Hotel, the one just before you get to Bite Bridge? Was it in that general area?
It was to the east. I believe it was to the north and east of Bite Bridge.
Right. Okay.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I can't really remember, but I remember we were at an airfield, and there were actually quite a lot of civilians also killed in that incident, like the camp followers. But that was a very, very successful attack. I think 14 terrorists were killed, not with any help by me, of course, but it was just the whole incident was quite funny.
Yeah.
And then I have another incident that ended up in the demise of 3 terrorists, and it also involved a tremendous amount of rain. This was a direct support from artillery. So my platoon, and we had 7 sticks that we had to walk. And of those 7 sticks, 2 were artillery people as well, acting as riflemen because we were short. And we were both spread out on each side of the river, the Booby River. And Artie were going to supply the attack in the morning, the Big Bang we called it, on the camps. There were 3 camps that we were going to attack. It was raining cats as dogs, and we were set off in Rodef trucks and were dropped off just after dark. As we walked and reached the chosen area, I dropped off a stick. It was, as I said, dark and miserable. And we didn't have GPS. There was no stars. So we were actually walking by time, how long it would take us. And then we figured out where we would be. And we set up for the night in this really, really wet area. Well, it had turned wet with the rain. And we were stop groups for when the artillery fired. So we were sleeping. And at 5 a.m., when the artillery started to fire, we woke up with a hell of an explosion. And we had walked too far and were closer to the target than anticipated. And these rounds were landing about 200 yards away, though some of the artillery who were with us figured some of them may have been 100 yards away. But we leapt out of our sleeping bags and rushed backwards out of the way. And then we were about 500 yards away. I gathered all my guys together. We left our sleeping bags where they were, and we set up our stop groups. I left 2 sticks back there and took my stick, and we followed the river. It was still raining, and there was no more artillery, and it was starting to get light. So as we were walking along, we looked up, and there were 3 walking towards us with their heads down in the rain. Unbelievable. So we both saw each other at the same time, but we killed them. And I actually, somehow I got a photograph of this lot that was sent to me, the dead bodies that was sent to me by Captain Andy Barrett at the time. And his note on that thing, and this was years ago, he sent it to me. It says, "Tags Balson, booby arty stop kill." And I don't think my heart stopped pounding for a week. Whenever there was a big bang or a clatter or something, I was freaked out. And I spoke to Neville Vickery about this. And he said, in reality, when those shells came down, we were actually almost in the kill zone. And it was luckily that we were still in our sleeping bags. So it's amazing. It's amazing what we survived, actually. So that was actually quite funny.
Yeah, it comes.
And another time we did an attack with artillery, and we wasted a lot of the government's money on shells, because when we swept through the camps later on, they'd all been abandoned for about a week.
Oh, no. And what was that internally in a similar sort of area, Beitbridge area?
Yes, all this was in Beitbridge.
All Beitbridge area, yeah.
Yes, and it was amazing. Don Price was actually quite incredible in the fact that he knew a lot of people, and he knew his superiors, and they trusted him. And we had a tremendous amount of kills. And we ended up with Fire Force Delta. We had permanent artillery, and we could have South Africans helped us sometimes. And even after that, before one Indep moved to Fort Victoria, Don Price had gone to RLI, and the South Africans actually came across the river in force, the Limpopo, and completely took over the whole southwest area there. Wow. On the Rhodesian side. And their idea was to keep that whole area clear of terrorists, so that everybody who was leaving Rhodesia, and specifically, there was a lot of South African equipment in Rhodesia. They have 5.5s and everything else. And they wanted to keep the road open, the road from Bulawayo, those 2 Vs. Yeah. And that was what the South Africans wanted to do. And we came across the river, and there was another officer called Budgie Bredenkamp who was with us as well. And I spoke to the South Africans, actually. We were on a hill, the Rhodesians, we were advising them, myself and Mark Hellam and a couple of other guys. And we could look down into the valley, and you could see all the lights from all the South African sticks where they were having fires. It was crazy. Absolutely crazy. But they did do some good work there.
Yeah.
Came in, they repaired a lot of the wells that had been destroyed by the terrorists for the local villages and that. And that was a very, very interesting bush trip. We had choppers there as well, South African ones. And I flew in the K car one day. And we were looking, apparently there was a report of some terrorists, but we didn't see them. But we flew over the Limpopo River, and it was amazing. There were hundreds of people in the Limpopo digging on its banks and in the side. Very colorful looking thing. All the locals were there. And I think I think they were digging for gold. I never ever found out what the story was, but it was just interesting to see in the middle of a war, there were a lot of people running around the bushes.
Yeah, yeah. Did you ever personally operate with any of the South Africans, Alan?
Yes, this was one of them, and it was all very clandestine. We had to go across in sealed trucks so they couldn't see that there were Rhodesians going across. And then we went to the camp on the one border. And it was really interesting for the South Africans because they were all whites there. And yet we had black trackers with us and other AS. And of course, they had to come into the mess. And it was the first time that the South Africans had ever had black people in the mess with them, actually eating. And then they wanted some of the blacks to have a drink, but it was funny. Most of our trackers, and I don't know what tribe they came from, but one of them was called Mabena, and they never drink. They were completely sober. It was against their religion to drink, and that really confused the South Africans. But so we operated with them, and I remember a general came out on the Rhodesian side, and he came to inspect us and them, and I had been in the chopper a little earlier flying. This is a crazy story. And I saw a kudu running down below. And so I said to the chopper tech, shoot that kudu, but he couldn't hit it. So I shot the kudu and it fell right down, but Tracer had started a fire. So Mark Hellum and a few other guys were in the camp. And I said, hey, can you see the smoke from the fire? And they said, yep. I said, go and pick up the kudu. So they went there and picked up the kudu, came back to camp, and we had it strung up, and we were skinning it. And the South Africa general was walking around, and he said, oh, let me guess, those are the Rhodesians with the kudu.
Yeah.
So that was really funny.
They were good guys. I've listened to all of their talks, the Parabats and all that lot that fought down there in the Five Recce and all that. And yes. I believe they were quite aggressive soldiers, the South Africans. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. In fact, I was very afraid one day when we had taken a break, the four Rhodesians, and we had sort of sat in some bush and we were making some coffee. And all the South Africans were advancing across the ground towards us. And I said, oh my God, we're going to be shot because they'll think we're... But so I took off my shirt and I walked out from the tree, white man. I mean, I'm about as white as you can get.
White terrorist.
And then it was fine.
Yeah.
And we contacted them by radio.
Yeah.
But we were on two different channels because we were talking to their head office and those guys were talking. We didn't have two radios, but after that we always had two radios.
Mm-hmm.
So it was actually very interesting. And they eventually came and took over the one Indep camp at Bite Bridge. And we had South Africans manning mortars there and everything. And then shortly after that, once they had the whole camp under control, and amazingly, the mess operated in Rand at that time, not Rhodesian dollars.
Oh, really?
It's a bit of a unique story for Rhodesia.
Yeah.
You know, it may not have been the last contact, but it certainly was one of the last. And it probably didn't go down in recorded history. But Support Commando had a fire force call out in February of 1980 during the ceasefire. Wow. We were called out from Grand Reef, and Major Fandel was the car commander. We had 4 call signs on the ground, and the CTs had left an assembly point, and we were called in. A contact ensued after a sweep through a village, and also there was a bit of a banana plantation there, so it was very thick, and there were a lot of fences we had to climb over. One thing I do remember is when we were sweeping through the village, there were large cracks in the rocks. And when we were walking around and you could look down, all the little kids had climbed down into these cracks and were just lying there looking at us as we walked past. And the CTs had set up a mortar position and they actually sent a few mortars our way. And the end result was there was one CT killed. He was running away from the kraal, and the mortar crew left out the back of the plantation, but we found the base plate. We picked it up. We had some problems with the monitoring force questioning what we were doing over the radio. And Major Fandel was on the radio. And the rest of the CTs in the assembly point, now we're talking thousands, they had left the assembly point and were coming towards us.
Oh.
And we were actually on a hill. And so when Pete Fandel was asked who gave him permission to conduct this operation, he replied, Lord Soames gave us permission because these guys had left the assembly point. So while we were there, an amazingly strange thing happened. All the choppers left to go and get refueled. And we had gone back up onto a hill, and there was a guy, an Australian, who had joined our forces, Tony Young. And he was with a stick. And I met him years later, and he said, boy, this was really strange. So we all went back up onto the hill. And I think there were 8 or 12 of us there. And with the choppers gone to refuel, and it was quite a far way they had to go to the land tail to get the fuel, we really thought that we were going to be taking on 2,000 soldiers. But anyway, these Zanla, I think they were mainly Zanla forces there. It was on the east side of near Nyanga. And so we discussed what was going on. I had some spare ammunition. I always carried a green sleeve of ammo in my backpack.
Wow.
And no one else had, everyone was just hitched with 100 rounds to go out. But anyway, I had this green sleeve and I took it out and dished it out amongst our guys because I had run out of ammunition one time prior. And we had expended a tremendous amount of ammunition going through this thick banana plantation. So you have never heard choppers or that thumping sound of them coming towards you. It was the best sound ever in the world. We had one captured person that we had captured there with us. And we all flew out of there. But honestly, when we were sitting on that little hilltop, or it was just a small rise in a field, actually, it was a very bad feeling when we saw all these people, you know. And anyhow, we got out of there. And that was the end of that. We were demoted back to Salisbury immediately after that contact. And I always thought this was the last contact, but, you know, there may have been another one, but it was definitely during the ceasefire. And we spent that night at, I think it was 3 Indep in Nyanga.
Mm-hmm.
And there were monitoring forces with us spending the night in the officers' mess where I was. And I discussed with them about what was going on and the mortars. And none of these guys had ever been under fire before. So it was actually quite interesting to chat with them. But they weren't that particularly friendly, because even when I was with Support Commando, we had 2, this was after the war, we had 2 permanent monitoring force people with us at all times. Even when we went up to Victoria Falls and places, they were with us as well. And I suppose anyone else who was still in the army at that time will remember all those stories.
Yeah, yeah. And do you remember the date of that final incident of yours, in case historians ever checked to see if it was the last incident with the RLI? Do you remember the date?
It was in February.
It was February, wasn't it? Yeah.
February 1980. And I can't really know. I know that Tony Young in Australia figured that it pretty much was one of the last ones, but there's another incident that claims it's the last one. It may well be. I have no idea about the timings on that, but it was. We went from Grand Reef to Nyanga. We had the punch up, and then we demoted.
So if that had happened after the 18th, you'd actually had war in the Zimbabwean era. Yeah.
Yes.
Something. You were still fighting the war when it was Zimbabwe. Oh boy.
Yeah, but the crazy thing was, though, about the whole Rhodesian thing, I can remember there being, when I was at the RLI barracks after the war, there were a couple of enemy combatants, I suppose you could call them, who were officers and were there. And I can remember that even the war was over, there were still call-ups of white soldiers continuing to RLI, right the way up to intake. I believe it was 169 or something.
Unbelievable.
And that's pretty hard to believe.
Yeah,
after it was Zimbabwe.
In that light as well, I don't know if you've listened to some of the latest talks, but the Inchambani battles at the end of 1980 and 81, territorial soldiers were called up, and they actually came to Brady Barracks and put their kit on and got in crocodiles and drove out the front gate and got involved in the two battles. And that really stunned me when I heard that. I mean, it's all right for regulars to do it, but to be called up in Zimbabwe as an ex-Rhodey soldier, I don't think I would have enjoyed that too much.
No, and that's where Graham Watson-Smith was with RAR there as well.
Right. I think we jumped the gun a little bit. How did you get into RLI? I believe Don Price encouraged you to do so, or what was the connection there?
What happened was we were going to be moving to Fort Vic. We had a new, there was Captain Charlie Fondell, the brother of Pete Fondell, the major, was the OC there for a while. And then he left. He was from Llewellyn. And he left, and Major Moore took over. I was at the time 2IC of 1 Indep. And we moved to Fort Victoria, and we demobed. We mobed out into the bush almost immediately after that. And there was a real sad thing. One guy called Grant Matthews was on an OP, and some tourists had seen them and fired at them, and he actually was killed there along with an AS soldier.
Wow.
And I had applied to go to RLI about the same time as Don left, because Don took over 3 Commando after the OC of 3 Commando was killed, Bruce Snellgar, Major Bruce.
I knew him from school, yeah.
Yes, and I had operated with Major Bruce, and 3 Commando had been a fire force down with us in Bight Bridge, and we had a real large incident involving Ethiopian, well, wearing Ethiopian camouflage, and there were about 60 of them. Theo Nell and myself had, and 2 other guys, had run on spoor for about 30 kilometers, and they left a huge track through the bush.
Yeah.
And when we finally made contact, RLI were there, and they came in and they did everything else. And I got to know Bruce Snellgar quite well then. And so when Don went to RLI, Theo Nell left and he went there. And I said, I'd like to go there. So I applied, and then I got a message that I was to join up immediately in the new year after the elections.
And I believe you were
not the elections, yeah.
You were with Neil Jackson. Did he also transfer at the same time?
No, Neil Jackson came from the RLI as 2IC.
All right.
And then he went to brigade as a captain in Bulawayo.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
And you were then promoted to a full loot.
I was promoted to a full loot, and there was a funny story behind that. They wanted us to go and train soldiers from the opposition at School of Infantry into our way of thinking, and there was shortage of people. A lot of people were actually gapping the military at that time, and this might have been in March or April of 1980, and I was promoted to a full loot, and I stayed for a while longer. And the very, very last thing that we had was we formed, in the run-up to the elections, battle groups. I don't know if you remember those at all, but ours was called Combat Group Delta, and it involved support commando, anti-tank troop, and there was a group of terrorists at Dendera Mission that were had threatened to break out again, very similar to what we had encountered in February. And they were all told to stay there. So our whole battle group with artillery 5.5s and 25 pounders, armored cars, RLI, a whole bunch of TF. We went there, and it was going to be a conventional warfare operation run by Charlie Orst, Colonel Orst.
Okay.
And we were all given orders that night. Now, the war was long over, and we thought, oh my God, we're all going to go and die tomorrow, because we were going to attack this group of 5,000 people who had been assembled. And they were digging in and putting up their heavy machine guns already. And there's a bit of story on this one in the history of the RLI, or the book that I think Chris Cox and Mark Adams wrote, called Africa's Commandos. And it was at Dendera, and a friend of mine was also with Buttonshaw, a different commando, and he was up with artillery. And anyway, that attack was called off at H hour. Absolutely amazing. And
some skullduggery from the South Africans, I think.
Yeah, well, the South Africans were supposed to come in and bomb the place, and they didn't.
Yeah.
So that was the problem.
Yeah, I mean, from a political side of it as well, I think they just wanted the whole thing to die down. Alan, just one last question. Were you readily accepted by the RLI as a national service lead, or did they sort of look
no. Interesting enough, I had signed on regular while I was with the RAR.
Ah.
And I became a regular soldier 1 year into my military career, which was actually for 3 years. And I signed up a regular, and my parent regiment was RAR. So if I have a photograph I can send you, where when we had dining in night at RLI, I was one of the very few people in the RLI who wore RAR badges on my scarlets, because they were my parent regiment.
Oh, excellent. Yeah.
So
and
it was really good.
You have sent me some photographs that John will put up in the talk of that attack where the group was mobilized with a whole lot of 106 anti-tank guns.
Yes.
You were getting ready to go out on that mission with the anti-tank weapons?
Yes. That was the mission at Dendera, Combat Group D. And we were going to attack. There were other some portions of my troop were with other commandos on the attack, and I was with headquarters, and we were to attack straight down an open grassy slope and fire. We were supposed to immobilize some of the buildings there with a round called Hesh, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
and
high explosive squash head. Yeah.
Yes. And all I could see, we were going to go down, unload our weapons. After we had fired everything we had, we were going to unload our weapons, and we were going to join the infantry in the attack once it was done.
Wow.
But we were given formal orders the night before. It was pretty harrowing.
Well, I once saw a list of the dispensation of troops that were going to attack all of these RV places, and some of the sort of battle order was like 400 guys against 5,000, and 250 against 2,800. And if the order had been given for all of those camps to be attacked, who knows what it would have turned into? Well,
I'll tell you what. A friend of mine wrote a very interesting thing. He said if that attack had been run, it would have been a different outcome completely. Because even though we had artillery and all the bombers that were going to come in from South Africa, personally at the time, and a lot of my troopers as well, we were like, bloody hell, we're going to get killed here. Honestly, it was quite a serious thing. But, we weren't backing down and we were ready to go.
And if I remember correctly, the camp that you were facing was very heavily in favor of our guys versus some of the other keeps. They, like I said, they had like about 200 men attacking 3,000. And I just can't understand the logic of how it would have worked, really.
No, except one thing that was interesting, and they've always tried to, people I've spoken to have sort of denied that this was ever said. But when we were getting orders, no matter who was in the keep at the time was a target. And so that might have created a real serious international incident, because there were these monitoring forces were in the keep at that time. So, we weren't told to attack them, but we were told that if they were still there, they were in the line of fire or something.
Well, they would have become instant targets as well, purely through the reasoning amongst the Terrs is that the Marungus, are we going to kill them anyway? I don't think at that precise moment.
I don't think it wouldn't have been us who killed them.
Yeah, no, not at all. No.
Anyway,
I have sorry. Do you have anything else to say before we close, Alan?
No, not really. That's about it. I had my time in the military forces, especially in Bite Bridge. I mean, there were contacts that we had there that I didn't mention today, that we killed 13 terrorists on the ground, with their support as well. And it was an amazing time and a real eye-opener. And I was very, very happy to have Don Price as the major to tell us what to do. He was an excellent, excellent person.
Yeah,
and Theo Nell and Mark Hellam were very, very good friends of mine, and very, very experienced soldiers.
Would you be willing to come on for a second talk, even if it's a shorter one, to give some talks on these attacks you're talking about? It'll be a pity for them to go into history without being discussed.
Yeah. Oh, I can do that, because I have a lot of attacks I can tell you about where I was the OP and we were calling attacks.
Oh, outstanding. Yeah, that's great.
No, that'll be good. I could actually do that.
All right. Well, we'll liaise behind the scenes. And my very last question before we close, Alan, is how did you find the switch from working with African troops in a national service scenario to white regulars? Was it obviously, as an officer in a regular unit, you'd have a lot more admin, but at the same time you'd have different behavioral attitudes or different skills. How did you find that?
Well, I found that the one thing a lot of people forget is that all my AS soldiers were all regulars.
Oh, yes, of
the
course.
only national service people were the European soldiers, the ES, but also I did have some national service. We had a national service officer called Moses Magui. He was called up because he was an engineer.
Right.
And he had been to university, and he was an amazing, amazing fellow. He took over my platoon, because at the time I was, he was intake 164, and I was 2IC the company at that time, or acting 2IC. They hadn't sent down someone to replace Neil Jackson. And he was a very hard taskmaster. And he would treat all his soldiers, white or black, identically. And when I think one Indep was a very, very professional group of soldiers.
Yes.
And I think I've actually found literally no difference with going from one Indep, and I was a regular soldier there for about a year, but running with the National Service ES. And going to RLI was no different. They were all about the same.
Yeah, and many facts, some people have called it the fifth commando. So, yeah, no, that's really interesting. Or the fourth commando, for whatever.
Yeah. We had a lot of foreigners in support commando. And I was almost classed as a foreigner because I had come down from Zambia even though in 1975.
Mm.
And my parents, though, were in Papua New Guinea at that time. So I was very friendly with all the Australians and the Americans that were there.
Yeah.
So it
Excellent.
was really good. It was excellent. And our captain there was a guy called Mike Jack.
Mm-hmm.
And he had come down from the Sultan of Oman's army, and he was a very good man as well.
Interesting. There's so much to talk about it, but unfortunately, due to time limits, we're going to have to end this now.
Yes.
I just want to say it's been absolutely fascinating listening to your story, and you've done it very well. And just look out on the email side of things, and we'll arrange for a second talk. Okay, Alan?
Okay, that'll be good.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for coming on board. Cheers.
We'll see you then.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Excellent.